Hi, I'm Susan. I'm from Worldpeacefull, and this is part 3. And this book is Disaster Capitalism that I'm reading from, which is absolutely essential understanding for the public to try and get a hold on what is going on so then they can be empowered to make decisions and also do their own research, which is what I always encourage. You listen to me by all means, but listen to lots of voices and make up your own mind. So I'll continue. In Europe, many corporations and lawyers shamelessly exploit international investment deals to derive profits from suing crisis-ridden nations. Market speculators pressurise fragile nations such as Greece, whose citizens are forced to survive with fewer public services. I just might add in, I was in Greece when they were really suffering, and you could see the unhappiness in the people there. Beautiful place. You look at the beaches around Athens, it was just gorgeous. But the people were suffering because they weren't getting paid. I mean, the country was broke. Really poor decisions been made in their governments. Corruption had happened, and the country was broke. British citizens living on the margins face eviction or spiralling rent increases because global fund managers such as Westbrook, based in the United States, purchase homes as assets to be milked for profit. In Australia, what I've noticed is that a lot of the old stock, which would have been cheap rentals, is being knocked down. And we no longer are having the beautiful big backyards we used to have and play in as children. Now they're erecting these very modern square block buildings that have no backyard, hardly any garden. So children don't grow up with any sort of connection to nature other than going to parks. And that's hard for parents to get to parks when they're busy like they are. But the building of, 2 units on the one block of land is the very greed that I've been referring to in previous parts to this video series. It's very sad, and we've also got speculators coming in who are demanding property, which increases the prices. We've got greed within the real estate community who are also becoming extremely powerful because they're making millions out of houses. Houses that were, for example, $80,000 here when I was young in the 80s, I remember, went up to $300,000 within a year. Now we're looking at minimum prices of $500,000, $500,000. Now wages haven't increased. In fact, in the lower areas, lower socioeconomic, I remember in the 1980s I was paid $20 an hour as a secretary. I was offered $17 an hour as a woman with a degree a few years back. So wages had actually gone backwards. Now in Australia, what had happened with the accord-based process, we used to have a arbitration commission here in Australia which was setting the national wage case. So all occupations were categorised and there were wage settings. The unions were good here and they were able to negotiate the balance of power with business, which is extremely important. Unions got demonised, and also they didn't help themselves when they also had pockets of corruption. But nonetheless, the union movement was an advocate for working people who didn't have the power individually to negotiate fair wages. And because of the nature of the system, where wages are seen as a cost of production, they're seen as reducing profit if they go up. This is why wages often go down. Now, when there's inflationary periods, real wages fall. As prices rise, we might see increases in energy, which we're seeing at the moment. Real wages fall when that happens. What we call the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, which is a basket full of goods that they cost out as an average price setting. They usually work out the CPI on that, and that typically goes up every year. That's why we see prices rising all the time. These are all structured into the system. But wages aren't always rising because the employers don't want to pay more because they don't want to reduce their net profit. And that's where always the tension between labour and employers have been. And yet if we were to knock away all of these labels and just see people and see civilization and see maximising potential and shifting the consciousness to look at our activity in a different way, away from what we're programmed into thinking, we'll start to see that it's a self-defeating system and that ultimately we're all connected. And there's a guilt inherent within those who are doing very well. That's why they often talk about giving back, because they know that they've done well. And, you know, it's an unfair system. When you're a wage employee, there's no way you're ever going to make any money. And they'll just argue that, well, you haven't shown the entrepreneurship. Well, no, you haven't been given the equal education. If we've got a class system happening with grammar schools, private religious-based educational institutions that get, you know, high-paying customers using their schools, they're obviously going to get access to higher paying jobs. And then you've got the public school system, which through propaganda is seen as not as good. And there may well be some validity in some cases, because obviously if you're going to pay people more, the best teachers, typically they say, will go into those higher paying areas. But that doesn't always follow. I've seen brilliant teachers in the public school system myself. But there's often a lot more children. And they're also dealing with more socio-economic problems, because at that level, people are struggling. So it's a bit more complex situation, socially speaking. So everything has a reason behind it, but ultimately we're equal. We just have unequal circumstances where, if you like, it's a bit like a horse race where there's weightings. If you're in the lower socioeconomic, there's lots of weightings on that horse. It doesn't mean you're going to have an equal race here. It's not a level playing field, because we're not all coming from the same page. If all education was equal, and only at university levels was there some I'm not even keen on that myself. I'd like all education to be free, to be honest. In Australia, we had all free education right up to 1989. Then it became what we call HECS, Higher Education Contribution Scheme. We had to pay back. But Australia had free education, and that's how you enshrine egalitarianism in policy and in structures. So the public don't know that they've come at it from a disadvantage, and they only know what they know, or you don't know what you don't know. So you're kept in ignorance. And that's where the advantage is gained by those who do know. So going on with this book, the International Monetary Fund traversed the world with the backing of Western elites, strong arming nations into privatising their resources and opening up their markets to multinationals. Resistance to this bitter medicine is only one reason that large swathes of Latin America have become more independent since the 2000s. The massive privatisation that results, a central plank of US foreign policy, and that's how we know we've been influenced by the United States here in Australia, because we're seeing the changes that mirror the US system. So clearly there is foreign interference in Australia. So this US foreign policy guarantees corruption in autocracies. WikiLeaks State Department cables offer countless examples of this, including in Egypt under former President Hosni Mubarak. The World Bank is equally complicit and equally unaccountable. In 2015, it admitted that it had no idea how many people have been forced off their lands around the world due to its resettlement policies. And see, once you remove people from their land, they can't grow their own food. They lose self-sufficiency, and that makes them dependent on private property owners. So these are all strategies. The story barely made the news and no heads rolled, so no accountability is the point. One Californian town, Maywood, took the privatisation memo a bit too seriously. It literally outsourced everything in 2010, sacking all municipal workers, including the police department, due to budgetary pressure. We will become 100% a contracted city, said Angela Spacia, Maywood's interim city manager. I want to say here in Melbourne, I had a chat with a council worker, and he'd been working for the council here for 25 years. And he said, it's all getting outsourced. People are losing jobs when they had jobs for life. Can you imagine where they're going to go? They've only had one job, or maybe a couple. This is what privatisation does. You lose that stability. And we can, again, use propaganda and say, oh, look how lazy they are. I remember that. But you know what? We're not meant to be working harder. We're meant to be working smarter. Not smart cities smarter. Let's say working more intelligently would be more accurate terminology. I don't want to add to the branding of smart cities because I consider that problematic as well. Decades of anti-government rhetoric claiming that taxpayer money is always wasted have convinced many voters that the corporation knows best, which is why a sustained campaign against predatory capitalism is so hard to keep up. Not helped by the fact that 90% of Americans rely on information from media outlets owned by only 6 multinationals, including News Corporation, Comcast, and Viacom. Rupert Murdoch tried to acquire Time Warner in 2014. Had he succeeded, the market would have shrunk even further. In this environment, the fact that movements such as Occupy are born and thrive, albeit briefly, is a remarkable achievement. I just want to add in there that the problem we're facing is civil society is not organised. They're not as sophisticated as the corporate players, and because many of them go through their passions, their volunteering, the corporates definitely have the edge in that they can, how did they term it? Pathological cooperation. Let's just cooperate and be ruthless about reaching our goals. And because they're employers, they're paying money, people will do as they say. But we are at a very difficult point here where we're looking at the collapse of the planet, I think. I can see that the resources are being extracted because we're not replacing. We're seeing the fish stocks getting fished out. We're seeing the plankton disappearing. We're seeing what they call sort of keystone species being wiped out. Now, when those keystone species are wiped out, it actually has a knock-on effect of other species that depend on it. Because nature has some really powerful species that, if you like, stabilise the actual other species around them. Also, the deforestation, the cutting down of trees releases CO2. There's also the grasses, the natural flora, which ensures the soils are protected. There's also homeostasis. There's a integration in those particular ecosystems. I remember when I travelled Australia, I literally saw the ecosystem changing every few kilometres. I saw changes in the flora, and it showed me how sensitive my country is. And then I thought of the Indigenous 50,000-year history where they knew every part of this nation, and they were all different tribes, thousands of different tribes that had specific knowledge of country. And we think we can talk sustainability as if we can sound authoritative on the world stage, but we don't know how to live in harmony with the planet at all. We have no clue. We couldn't live for a week, more than a week, without supplies. We can, that you can train up soldiers and say, oh, yeah, we'll teach you survival. But you know what? And, the soldiers probably can, but they don't have the spiritual connection to the land. They might be practical. They can chop down this and that and create sheds and boats and what have you, and spears. But ultimately, these things take thousands and thousands of years to adjust. Indigenous people, 50,000 years is a long time, and to treat them like they're savages? I mean, who's ignorant? We had no respect. And it's not just Australia, it's right across the world. In all Indigenous societies, we had no respect for the true, deep, spiritual ecological knowledge. It's only now that we're starting to look toward them because we don't know how to solve this. We're creating massive disruptions, and this has got nothing to do with the IT area. The real disruption is to the ecosystem, which is mirroring our own disruption because we're not at peace. We're not in harmony with the planetary systems. We're in a dominator form of economics which doesn't know how to harmonize with Earth systems where need equals want. In my book, A Fool for Peace, I talk about holistic economics as a starting point. Also, gross national happiness is critical as well, because when you're happy, you're in balance. Peace is also another word for balance. When you are at peace with who you are and you don't need any more, where you're actually able to be still and feel fulfilled without having to take anything more. That's the true peace that we don't know. We keep having these satiate our appetites because we think we need more because we're not enough. See, there's psychological stuff that we're not acknowledging because we've not been taught to look at the internal drivers of our behaviour. And when we look at the algorithms and the IT smart world, they're trying to affect behaviour to maximise profits, which is going to sink the planet faster because they're not natural. See, demand and supply were set up so that natural demand was being responded to by supply, and the whole premise behind that economic system was that the real needs were being met. Adam Smith, quite contrary to the free market dogma, was very much against the mercantilists, which are the traders. He was very much against the distortion and sticky prices that occurred because of market concentration. This is the bigger trading companies. So he wanted a free-floating demand and supply. That was why the invisible hand was created, was to stop the prices from being fixed at high prices and allow the market to determine it. And the market was the people. The market was not the business community. That's where his teaching was distorted. People go, oh no, free markets, don't get in the way of the markets. Get rid of regulation. It's only going to cost us more. No, the regulation is to ensure the safety of the public so that you don't step over your boundaries and cause a harm because of greed and the drive for more, because you've got a blind spot. You've lost that integration emotionally because of the masculine-feminine issue that I've raised in the previous parts. Can you see where I'm coming from? So the invisible hand was actually to make sure that resources were allocated fairly and were truly responsive to market signals where demand was met, and typically economies of scale. So price would come down when we were able to produce more things. I'm getting fly. Isn't it funny? There's a lot of flies, and that's a distortion too in the climate, I feel. I haven't seen this many flies. It's interesting. Honeybees just came to me then. That's another thing that's being impacted by the EMF is the bees, and the bees are actually another keystone species. They're kind of like a turnkey species. I'm just thinking of what the actual word is. It's like turnkey. Cassowary is another one. We're ignorant. We don't know that we don't know. And we think we can buy up whatever we need because we're so out of touch with the ecological balance which has been developed over 4 billion years. But in our arrogance and our ignorance, we forge ahead, getting caught up again in the same addiction that is sinking the planet. That's why this is a wake-up call, what I'm doing. This is not about us and them, it's about us, because it's about all of our survival. How will people feel if they go and set up a base on Mars or the moon when they know that the planet's been destroyed? It's not going to feel good. Where people are responsible for the collapse of entire civilization because they didn't listen. They didn't wake up. So my feeling is we are going to wake up. I'm certainly going to help as best I can, because it's the responsibility of those who know to tell the blind horseman on the blind horse that he's heading towards the abyss, and that's precisely what my videos are about. I'm simply here as a guide to help. You have to choose ultimately. Because as I said before, it's your children and grandchildren that you're actually deciding for. It's got nothing to do with me. So I talked about the IMF and the privatisation of resources in other countries. That Latin America did try to resist, and it did actually stave off some of this. They also had very strong socialism and community. They had strong community, and that's why quite often those who want control want to break down community and the family. They also want to break the feminine so she doesn't have control over children. And this is a pathological mindset that doesn't understand its fundamental integration with the whole. So it's an ignorance. So WikiLeaks and their cables were of assistance to reveal corruption and illegality. So the World Bank has also been mentioned. People were forced off their lands, and I talked about California and the municipal workers losing their jobs, and police department too. So decades of anti-government rhetoric claiming that taxpayer money is always wasted. I mentioned that as well. So there's campaigns against predatory capitalism. There's only 6 multinationals that own the media. And remember I mentioned Murdoch, Rupert Murdoch. He didn't actually get to purchase Time Warner, which would have created even more market concentration. We had the very brief Occupy movement, and as I was going into a narrative there on the disorganisation of civil society, which is problematic worldwide. And I certainly have noticed when I've seen protests recently that they are fighting against the system. You cannot fight, you have to actually problem solve. So my advice to activists would be you have to sit down with those that you deem as problematic. You have to sit with them. There's no point directing negativity at corporations, because it's only going to create more resistance from them because they'll feel threatened. We don't want to do that. We have to sit down and try and reach them as human beings. They are me. Brothers and sisters, yes. That's what I see as the weakness in the activist community, is fighting. I'm no believer in fighting. I think we need to speak the truth and do it gently, and you'll be more heard. And this is from a conflict resolution point of view. You will be heard when you truly come to them with love and truth in a gentle way. And it's for their highest good that you would be doing that, not just about your own interests, but it's about we, not us and them anymore. It's a division that's actually caused a lot of the polarity in humanity. We create wars, whether it's militarism or whether it's wars against the employers or employees. It's like this is all crazy war game stuff. It's like it doesn't work. We've got to mature to a point where we actually solve it. Mediation is a mature way of approaching things. We do have power blocks, and I've encountered power myself where they're not willing at all to listen to me, and I do note that. But I'm able to go with the flow with that. And if anything, I've become empowered through that blocking, providing I don't take it personally and I maintain integrity. Because things work out in their own way. Things work themselves out. You have to trust in that when you're seeing great change like this. If everybody panics, all jumps on the street and down with the system, it's going to create great fear in government. We don't want that. We want to inspire them to see really that this is in their interest, and it is. Indian writer Arundhati Roy, she's a terrific woman, saluted the power of this movement in a speech at the People's University in New York, Washington Square Park in November 2011. This was the Occupy movement she was celebrating. What you have achieved is to introduce a new imagination, a new political language into the heart of empire. You have reintroduced the right to dream into a system that tried to turn everybody into zombies, mesmerised into equating mindless consumerism with happiness and fulfilment. Although Occupy was dismissed as an irritant and irrelevant by many on Wall Street and in the corporate media, police unleashed a sophisticated surveillance operation to disrupt the protesters. See, rather than engage democratically, I have myself approached police and sought to intervene between protesters and police as a mediator, but they didn't go with it. It was disappointing because the police were seeing them as disruptors and they were seeing the police as enforcers, but I actually wanted both of them to hear each other so that democracy could function properly. Because I know from my peace studies work at La Trobe that you have a pressure cooker situation happening here when you suppress, and you're going to end up with more violence, and we don't want that. We don't want people harmed. No one harmed. And if we're mature, we're going to approach these situations differently. We're going to try and work the problem out. And even if it is that you go and create your own eco-village and live sustainable lives, live by example, that's also a great movement. You don't have to fight against the system because it actually puts it in place more firmly when people feel threatened. So it may well be parallel lives that have to happen, and certainly under the technocracy there's a cordoning off that will happen if people are not participating in that smart city system. If they're not contributing income, if they're living lives where they want to live off the land and have solar panels and collect water and homeschool, those are different lives. Maybe that has to be the way you move forward. So everyone has to choose, which path they take. So she goes on to say, although Occupy was dismissed, okay, I've talked about that. She goes on to say that they recognise the danger represented by the threat of a good idea. So she's talking about the system. The challenges faced by opponents of rampant capitalism was how to focus their rage coherently against increasing pervasive forces. So people are angry, obviously, because they can see things are falling apart. They're panicking. Study of capitalism is soaring at universities across America, indicating the desire on the part of tomorrow's graduates to understand the tenuous connection between democracy and the capitalist economy. I don't know if that's true, whether that's what they're desiring, but I think it needs to be explored because I'm seeing it as compliance or democracy. I'm not seeing the two coexist. I'm seeing a splitting off. The phenomenal success of French economist Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, a working argument that social discord is the likely outcome of surging financial inequality, indicates the public knows there is a problem and is in search of clear account of it. Piketty advocates a global system of taxation on private property. This is the only civilised solution, he told the Observer newspaper. In 2014, even the world's leading economist think tank, the Paris-based Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is the OECD, urged higher taxes for the rich to help the bottom 40% of the population. Yet here in Australia, we're seeing tax cuts to the upper end of town, so that's influence in my view. It's also happening in the United States, so that's a trend that's been influenced here in Australia. When establishment magazine Foreign Policy publishes an article by the US managing editor of the Financial Times, Gillian Tett, which closes expressing a wish for an honest debate about wealth redistribution, it is clear that the world has gone a little mad. And yes, of course, the taxation system was all about the redistribution of wealth. And it's not a question of, well, I earned that, I should keep it. People have to understand that there are inequities in the system that are structured in, and that people are actually giving their energy to give you your wealth. And yes, by contrast, you're giving jobs through the basis of making those decisions true. But nonetheless, we are saying that this person's energy is worth less than that person's energy. And typically those at the top are not actually working hard. They are the property owners. So everyone's creating it for them. This is why the idea of redistribution is there. It's to be fair. But the system itself is not fair, and it actually does need to be completely changed. Canadian journalist Naomi Klein coined the term disaster capitalism in her best-selling 2007 book, Shock Doctrine, which I'll talk actually in the next part. So we will now move to the next part.